Hey guys, it's Mr. Abbott from the Academy of Science and Citizenship. I hope you guys are having a great Friday. Today we're going to go over our notes for our bread experiment. Um, I know some of us, I've heard a little feedback that some of us aren't seeing too much on your bread. Don't you sweat that because sometimes experiments don't always go as you expect. That's why we do the experiments. Sometimes they're going to be a little bit different for each of us. We all have different conditions in our houses. We all have different temperatures and stuff. So it's going to be a little different for all of us. I personally used wheat bread this time. I'm used to using white bread. So it's been an interesting experiment for me. I've been tracking my bread just about every day to see how it's coming along. It's not as dramatic as I was thinking yet, but we still have time because next week we're going to take this experiment to the next level, but we'll get there in just a moment. So first we're going to go over our notes. It's like last time. I've got my picture of what happened before. We got some pretty clean looking bread. We got our water that we sprinkled on, and we got our bag. So for week one, this is what right now what we're taking our notes for. Let's take a look at our bread. Now, when you look at your bread, I highly recommend that you don't even take it out of the bag. Hopefully you should be able to see right through your bag. Don't take her out. Nobody needs to be breathing in the mold or anything like that. You don't need to be getting that stuff on your hands, which is why Mr. Abby is going to use a rubber glove. Not everybody has these kicking around right now, so do not sweat it. If you don't have any, I really recommend don't take it out of the bag at all. But so you guys can see a little better, I'm going to try to keep a nice clean operation, and I'm going to pull mine out for just a bit before I put her back so we can see what we continue to grow. Let's see what we've got here. I've been tracking mine. Now, I'm going to try to get her up here for the camera and see how well we can see it. There we go. You might notice on my bread that it's looking kind of lumpy. And if you're looking at it from my angle, you can see that some of the parts of the bread are starting to sink in a little bit, like something's breaking them down a little bit. If you see right up here, I've got a little bit, might be hard to see on the camera. I've got a little bit of white fuzz starting. That's a good sign. That's our mold starting to grow. You really don't want to breathe that in. I'm trying not to breathe too heavy while I'm around this right now, but I guess you can see a little better at this angle. Yeah, you can see how I'm starting to get it. It's starting to sink in a little bit. Something's breaking down that starch and those sugars. Something's on this bread. Something's getting started there. But these things can take a little bit of time, just like growing a seed. You're not going to see the roots and everything start immediately. Sometimes these experiments take a little bit of time. So I'm going to take a really good look at my bread. And if I were you guys, I would take a look at that right through your plastic bag and put it back in my bag. And when you use a glove like this, the best way to take it off, you got your stuff on here, your bacteria, your germs or whatever. What I recommend is you get underneath the glove. Notice I'm not touching the outside of the glove. You get right up underneath your glove and you pull it off, just touching the outside of the glove. So now all that yucky or whatever is stuck inside that glove, and I can just throw it away. Boom. Didn't have to touch the outside of the glove at all. Just on the inside, pulled it right off, inside out. Boom, ready to go. So now I'm going to take my notes. But today, since I've been writing my notes in big, bright purple, maybe a little bit of blue down there, so that you guys can see my notes really well. But today, because I think color is really important to this experiment, it's really good to know what you're seeing the way you see it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my bread today with a little bit of crayon because I like the colors. I like the way that crayon comes down onto paper. It doesn't like smear or leak into my paper at all. So I really like crayons for doing this kind of thing. So I'm just going to do the outline of my bread again for week one. We're going to check on this again next week. And I'm going to add a little bit to this experiment. So we're going to take it to the next level. So I got my outline. Boom. The browns, the dark browns, that crust. So first I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to put a little bit of gray where I saw the white fuzz. So I saw a little bit of white fuzz starting right here. Oop. It's a little hard to see, but I got my gray there. Just a little bit to start with, and the big things come from humble beginnings, right? So there's our start. I've also got, you know how I saw a lot of that lumpy, and you might not see it because I couldn't see it on the camera when I was showing it to you guys. A little less so on this side. You might see that I've got areas that are getting kind of dark and yellowish too. Maybe it looks like you can't see it a little bit on the camera. So not only is it sunken in a little bit in some of these areas, like it's kind of squishing down, but it's also quite a bit darker. And I've got some other colors and stuff that I didn't see before. So we got some nice, starting to really turn brown, dark brown in some of these spots. So what I'm going to use is not as dark as my crust. I'm going to get another light brown here. Ooh, if I can find one. This is why we organize our crayon boxes, kids. I'm going to kind of give myself some little kind of squiggle patterns here because that's where I'm seeing it. I'm seeing it's really starting to sink down in some of these areas. And what I'm going to do for myself too, to make it a little easier, is I like to put a little side note. I love to put little labels. Even when I was drawing things as a kid, I always like to put little labels because sometimes I have a hard time telling what I'm drawing. So I'm going to give myself a little label for fuzz, where I'm starting to see that fuzz. So I put a label there, and then I'm going to put another little label over here for where I start to see it turning darker, darker, and I'm also going to put that it's sinking a little bit. Now, it's hard to see that from there. Now, what I'm going to do for this little bottom area that I gave myself, I kind of gave myself a little area down here. This is going to be our week 2. That's going to be my week 2 area. So I might split that in half again too for when we get into our next experiment for next week too, because we're going to add a little bit to this experiment. What I'm going to teach you guys next week is when we're doing an experiment, sometimes you kind of know, you know what regular bread looks like. So you've got your, what we call in science, what we call a control group. So we know what regular bread looks like, so we're going to try this as our control group this time. We know what happens when things work normally. That's your control. Then when we change things, when we add our variables, when we change a couple things next week with the next couple pieces of bread that we're going to be using, we call those our variables. Those are the things that we've changed. And we can check how the things we've changed affect our experiment by using our control. So right now we're setting up a really nice control group. What happens to bread pretty much on its own? When it stays a little moist, like bread should be, what happens when it kind of goes on its own the way things normally work? When we add a variable, we want to see how does it change things. So if I'm making a new medicine, I might know that people, when they get a cold, they start to sneeze and they cough and stuff like that. So that's my control. I know what that looks like. It's good to have a control on hand, though, so you can check it versus, let's say I make a new medicine. I'm going to compare how does lemon juice work versus taking cough medicine. So those are going to be my two variable. Those are my two different groups. And if my group that does better with the lemon juice than the cough syrup group, we're going to know that lemon juice works really well. Or if the cough syrup group does better than the lemon juice group, I'm going to know that the cough syrup works better. But if neither of them do better than the normal group, then I know that neither of those two things really work. And that's why we use a control group. So we can tell if the things that we're doing actually change how the experiment works. So again, I like to give myself a nice big area here. I forgot to talk about, too, our hypothesis. I didn't fill that in because I wanted you guys to think about what you were doing. My hypothesis was going to be that I expected things to happen more along the crust. And I've been looking a lot at my crust, and I'm not really seeing that. And that's the nice thing about doing an experiment. You don't always get what you expect. I expected, because when I open a loaf of bread, most of the time when I see mold for the first time, I see it right on the crust. So I expect mold on crust first. That was my expectation. That's where I first expected to see anything going. And honestly, I'm not seeing that in this experiment. I'm seeing most of my action happen right where we sprinkled the water. All these little lumps and craters and stuff like that are actually where me and my daughter were sprinkling the water on last time. So I was kind of surprised by that. That's a nice thing about running an experiment. And if you have different results, make sure you let me know. So our first stage of our notes here, I've got some sinking, some darker areas where it's starting to sink in and something's going on there. I've got a little tiny bit of that white kind of, it almost looks a little like hair, or maybe like if you had stuffing come out of an animal, like a little bit of tiny, or a stuffed animal, just a little bit of tiny bit of that fuzz starting to go. So I suspect that that is where most of my mold is going to grow. I could even write another hypothesis for my next week, that I would say that that is where most of what I'm going to see is going to start growing. Some of us might have expected to see like a little bit more green and stuff in there. I've definitely seen that on some breads, but I'm used to that white fluff. You see that a lot when you're doing breads. So what I would do in preparation for our experiment next week, make sure you give yourself an area, or you can give yourself a whole fresh new page to start yourself the next level of our experiment, or again, just open yourself up a spot so that we can make group 1 and group 2. So this is our control group, where we just did the basic bread, a little bit of sprinkled water, and then we're going to have group 1 and group 2. And we're going to see what happens with those two groups next week, and what we're going to do to them to make it just a little bit different. And hopefully we'll see some good results on what happens when we change up our experiment a little bit. Can we make the conditions better for the mold? Can we find ways to make it harder for that mold and stuff like that to grow on our bread? Make it a little harder for that stuff to make our food go bad. I want you guys thinking about that. We'll get them in next week. And make sure you send me in your notes for week 1 on this experiment. And I look forward to seeing how this experiment grows next week. You guys have a great day.